Peter Geoghegan, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Ollie.
No problem. So, you have a book coming out, Democracy for Sale, and you've adhered to that age-old journalistic principle of following the money, and you found out, unsurprisingly, that money talks. Tell us about the thesis of your upcoming book, but we'll get to that. But let's start with how you started investigating this subject matter.
Well, to be honest, if you'd told me a few years ago that I'd spend about 3 years of my life researching and writing about the role of money in British politics, I would have been very surprised. So this book really started, I was in Sunderland about 2 days before the Brexit referendum. I was reporting for an Irish newspaper, and I was kind of just doing that kind of journalistic thing of wandering around the town, talking to people, getting a sense of what was going on. You know, we all know where Brexit went, and Sunderland became like a big name in the Brexit story. So a lot of people were talking about wanting to leave the European Union. That was interesting. And as I was leaving Sunderland, I was getting the train back, the metro into Newcastle. And I was sitting on it and I saw the metro, the free sheet, the free newspaper on the metro. And I kind of noticed it because it had a big wraparound ad in the front of it. It said, "Vote Leave, take back control," the Vote Leave slogan. And I flipped it over. This advert is paid for by the Democratic Unionist Party. And I thought that's a very curious thing. I'd worked as a reporter in Belfast before. I'd never heard of the DUP being particularly interested in campaigning outside of Northern Ireland. They're quite a parsimonious party. You wouldn't have seen them splashing the cash all over the place. I was like, where did they find the money to pay for this? Why are they advertising something like this? So I thought this was quite interesting. But I had a deadline. As lots of journalists do. Votes coming up. So I put the newspaper in my bag and kind of forgot about it. And then, lo and behold, a few months later, I got a phone call from another friend of mine, who's a journalistic colleague, my friend Adam Ramsey, who's at Open Democracy, and he said, "Do you know anything about this DUP, the DUP's Brexit funding?" Because I was in Edinburgh just before the referendum, and I saw all these placards that said they were, paid for by the Democratic Unionist Party. And what I was interested in this was I'd worked as a reporter in Belfast, so I knew that in Northern Ireland donations were secret. So you didn't have to say where money came from. And that was a kind of hangover from the troubles, from the violence in Northern Ireland. So to protect people, you didn't have to declare donations. And I'd always been interested in this because it seemed like a strange loophole, but generally it made no difference because during general elections, it's lots of constituencies. But for the referendum on Brexit, the whole UK was a constituency. So you could give money, you could funnel money to DUP anonymously, and they could spend it anywhere. So I ended up writing a big story, and I discovered that the DUP had this £435,000 donation for their Brexit campaign, funneled through a man in Scotland who said the money wasn't his, and who'd previously gone into business with the head of the Saudi secret intelligence, so quite a colourful character. And I became very interested in this. I was like, well, how does this work in Britain? Is it that easy to kind of get political influence? And that really was where the genesis of my book and my interest started. And then I ended up doing a lot of writing about the Leave campaign, the Brexit referendum. Aaron Banks, if you remember Aaron Banks, the man who allegedly spent £8 million on the Brexit referendum. And then I started more recently looking a lot more at political party funding in general in Britain. I've written about, how the Conservative Party get a lot of money from Russian donors. Just very recently, I did a big story about property developers bankrolling the Tories as well. And I've just looked at how easy it is to buy access. And to be honest, I was really surprised that this book is a kind of unexpected product of going down a rabbit hole and almost still being there 3 years later.
So we can get more into the detail, but if we just fast forward briefly, let's talk about your conclusion. What is the diagnosis then for British democracy because of the influence of this dark money upon it? What are the consequences that we're seeing?
I think there's a lot to be really concerned about, because dark money basically it's an American term that comes from Jane Meyer, who's a great journalist in New Yorker, and it really means like anonymous secret funding, like what you might think it means. But also that can have lots of impacts. It's not just money that goes to political parties. It can be money that goes to like lobbyists and think tanks from corporations that you don't know about because the lobbying rules in Britain are terrible. Or it can be adverts that are bought online anonymously, which is still so easily to do. And really my kind of conclusion, my whole thesis about the whole book is that we are basically British democracy, the rules of the game just aren't fit for purpose at all. They're completely outdated. It's so easy to override them. It's so easy to run roughshod over them. But also there's almost no penalty for it. For example, take Dominic Cummings, a very well-known figure. The Vote Leave campaign was found to have broken electoral law. Nothing happened. Dominic Cummings was called multiple times to go and give evidence to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee on what had happened during the referendum. He didn't bother going. And it's not done him any harm at all. He can go to, he's still perfectly able to go up to Barnard Castle and keep his job too. And I think that's the fundamental big problem, I think, in Britain, is that it's so easy to break the rules, and it's just so little payback for it. And it's so easy to influence political decisions. And I think what we're seeing now is really that's been heightened more and more. And we can see it, whether it's people who are who are political donors getting big government contracts, or even just the way like the no deal Brexit went from this really fringe idea. It's one of the big things I look at in my book, is how Brexit itself, but especially a no deal Brexit, went from this thing that nobody was talking about to almost the kind of the preferred outcome for many people. And a lot of that's to do with lobbying between America and Britain, because a lot of lobbying interests between the two countries and who work closely together. So yeah, that's the kind of conclusion, is quite a gloomy one, is that unless there's some radical change and radical overhaul of kind of our electoral laws and how we do politics, it's probably going to become even easier to influence political decisions.
What I find quite interesting as well is, I know when we often talk about money in politics and all the rest of it, people often, the first thing they think of is sort of super PAC funding in the States, big tobacco, big industries, big pharma, ploughing millions of dollars into political campaigns. One of the things that I find actually most interesting is that in the UK, the influence you can get, the bang for your buck, I mean, I call it incredible. For comparatively little, the level of influence that you can garner is quite extraordinary. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it is remarkable. It's actually one of the big things I kind of come back to again and again in my book, is that compared to the United States, you can buy influence so cheaply in Britain. And when I first started researching this and looking into it, I kind of felt like, oh, that means that Britain's got less of a problem with money. Because actually, unlike America, where you have to spend millions and millions, even on a down ticket race in a state, you'd have to spend a lot of money to get on it. Whereas in Britain, £50,000 a year will get you 4 dinners with the Prime Minister at the Conservative Leaders Group. So it's like, well, maybe Britain mustn't have as big a problem. But actually, the more I look at it, the more I think it's the opposite. Because money buys you so much access so cheaply, it means that it's much easier to influence the political process. Because in Britain, Britain and America are similar and very different to the rest of Europe, in that our parties run on private money. In Europe, it's very different. Mainly it's state funding. So it's really important for political parties to raise money from individuals. And we've never seen as much money in British politics. At the last general election, the Conservatives raised more than £40 million in just a few weeks before the election. And if you look at it, the top 50 donors in Britain gave more than 35 million, and almost all of that does go to the Conservatives. There was one big donation to the Lib Dems. Labour actually, the last election, got no money. I think they got £5,000 from the top 50 donors. So they really, really struggle with terms of getting political donations, which has changed a little bit now. But what that means is, and we're seeing it currently with this Robert Jenrick story and Richard Desmond, this planning issue has been going on, and Richard Desmond gave a donation of £12,000 to Conservatives, which is a tiny amount of money. And there's a sense in which it's really easy to buy access and influence. And it's not even just giving cash. It's about just buying a table at a Conservative fundraiser. It'll give you an opportunity to sit next to a minister, or even to sit next to the Prime Minister. All of those meetings are off the record. There's no list kept of who attends. There's no list kept of what's discussed or what's agreed. And I think there's a huge opportunity there to really buy access really cheaply. In Britain, if you contribute more than £7,500 to a political party, it has to be registered with the Electoral Commission and published. That sounds like very transparent. It's a good thing, but actually, often a lot less money will get you somewhere with a politician. You don't need to give that much money to have some influence and to have some opportunity to lobby. And I think that's a huge problem in British politics as well. Is that the parties all need to generate money, they need to run on money, and in order to do it, they have to sell access.
So in terms of cash-rich parties, you mentioned the Tories and how astronomically much more wealthy they are than the Labour Party. I know Labour has this a much more sort of grassroots funding model where it's widespread smaller donations, but something that's really interesting in the last sort of year in British politics has been the rise of the Brexit Party, and in a comparable way to Labour, really, they've had this huge crowdfunding effort. Paying members paying to be assessed as potential constituency candidates in the 2019 election, and then the Brexit Party not even standing candidates, in those constituencies. Their fundraising efforts have been quite remarkable as well, haven't they?
Yes, the Brexit Party is very interesting. There's an entire chapter in my book actually dedicated to the Brexit Party and its particularly strange funding model. Yeah, you're Traditionally, the Conservatives make all their money, they get their money from private donors. The Labour Party, as well as the unions, are huge backers of the Labour Party. Many years, actually, the Labour raised more than the Tories, but mainly from unions and from smaller donors. Whereas then the Brexit Party emerged in kind of March, April of 2019, out of nowhere. Actually, as I reveal in my book, after a discussion between Steve Bannon and Nigel Farage in early 2019 in America, and they kind of decided, I'm going to do this kind of grassroots party. They raised a lot of money through anonymous donations. There's a lot of questions then asked about those anonymous donations, because in Britain, if you give more than £500 to a political party, you do have to register it. It doesn't have to be published, but you have to register it. The Brexit Party were saying to people they could pay by PayPal, and they put a ceiling of £500 on it, but it was quite easy for people to pay multiple times. So there's a lot of questions about how much money the Brexit Party had raised. Also, the Brexit Party have raised more than £10 million from a single individual, a man called Christopher Harborne, who had briefly been a Tory donor, is based in Thailand, and has given the party astronomical sums of money, including after the general election, which is very curious considering that the party barely seems to exist anymore, and which makes him one of the biggest donors in British political history. And so the Brexit Party currently, by my calculation, has a huge surplus of cash, probably unprecedented surplus of cash in British politics. And what makes the Brexit Party really unique is that most political parties, like the Conservatives or Labour, are member-led organisations. So people join and they become a member. The Brexit Party doesn't have members. It only has about 3 or 4 members. Nigel Farage owns most of the company. And what it has is supporters. So the people who registered online are, as you say, the people who became registered to become candidates, and they paid money to become candidates. They weren't actually ever members of the party. They were just supporters. So that meant that they had no say in who was on the board of the party, who the leader of the party was. And what I go into in detail in my book is it's really similar to the model that a party called Five Star initially used, the Five Star movement initially. And Nigel Farage really based the Brexit Party on Five Star. He went out to Italy quite a lot before and after the Brexit referendum, and he met with the leader of Five Star, Luigi Casaleggio, and he got a real sense of how this party ran, and it's really interesting. It's the same model actually, and it's what I call is kind of it's kind of fake grassroots democracy, because it looks and sounds really democratic. You know, it's all done online. Brexit Party did a lot of stuff online. Five Star movement was all online, and the idea is that everyone has a say. But actually, when you look down at who the company, what you have is almost like a company takeover of political parties. So instead of really being member-led parties, they're actually companies that are owned by people, and these people own the assets of the company, which means if they get a lot of money coming in from donors and everything else, well, it's the company's money.
Yeah, there's a very interesting level of cooperation, isn't there? Sort of areas of the political spectrum that collaborate internationally, and I think that's, particularly when it comes to funding at least, something that you see for a lot of think tanks, for a lot of these so-called thought leaders, where you will often see, a faceless building, usually somewhere in Westminster, and inside that building, no one really knows who's there or owns it, but they start populating ideas into the British political space, the cultural space, the media space. Is there a good example of that perhaps you could talk us through? A think tank that's come around and how it's perhaps influenced British politics.
Yes, I think think tanks have had a really big role, I think, in recent years that has kind of been underappreciated. And this is very much an American model of think tank. So, if you think about a think tank, most people go, that sounds like a good idea. People who come up with ideas that could be policies and they could be taken on. And who's not in favour of that? New ideas, great. And that's kind of where think tanks came from. The problem is actually most of the people that you hear about as think tanks in Britain, or a lot of them, are actually really corporate lobbyists. They're paid for by corporations who don't have to declare their donations, because most of these think tanks are actually charities. Tufton Street is a great example of this. It's basically like a TARDIS. There's a couple of these kind of Georgian buildings on Tufton Street, round the corner from Westminster, and almost every few weeks another think tank appears in one of these, and they're all the same people shuffling from one to the other, often with very similar analysis of the world. Basically, privatize everything, privatize NHS, get rid of state assets, reduce right. It's a very, very well trodden kind of Thatcherite libertarian right wing view of the world. But where these think tanks, I think, have been very influential, especially in Britain, especially during the Brexit process, was that at a time, if you remember, cast your mind back to the distant days of about 2 years ago, when it wasn't clear where Britain was going. Would it be a soft Brexit? What would Brexit look like? These think tanks were very affected of like very quite flimsy policy documents that would then be taken on board by the European Research Group in particular, the kind of right wing of the Conservative Party, and held up as an alternative vision of what we could do. This was what was called like Plan A plus, and that's where these think tanks have been really important. And I write a lot in my book about one in particular, which is called the Institute of Economic Affairs. And it's a particularly interesting think tank because actually the Institute of Economic Affairs was started in the 1950s in Britain. And it was started by a man called Anthony Fisher. And Anthony Fisher basically he went actually to meet Hayek, who was a very famous libertarian economist in London School of Economics. And Fisher went to Hayek in his office and said, look, I want to try and change politics. He really hated, at that stage, Labour and the Conservatives were both very much into kind of basically big state. The Tories were big state too. It was all about basically state control.
The post-war consensus.
Completely, it was a really post-war consensus, and Fisher didn't like this. He thought it was anti-competitive. He didn't like it, and Hayek said to him, "Don't go into politics. What you want to do is change the ideas that the politicians talk about. It's not about being. You don't want to be the man at the front. You want to be changing the subjects they talk about." So this is where the Institute of Economic Affairs was born, and it was very successful. It started bringing around, but they also discovered something very good, which is that if you give people lunch and a few drinks, they get on much better and they enjoy themselves. So politicians started coming to their meetings. Ted Heath was there very early on, Enoch Powell as well, particularly Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher became very interested in their ideas, and really a lot of the Thatcherite ideas came out of the Institute of Economic Affairs and the kind of subsequent think tanks that went around it. What was particularly interesting about Fisher was he then moved to the States and took the think tank idea with him. And he built all these the biggest think tanks in the world are in the States, and they're all really kind of children of Anthony Fisher. He's thought to have set up over 150 right-wing think tanks. And what's interesting, where think tanks are particularly useful is that they're very good at capturing the media space because they're very professional. So, if you were a corporation, say you're, a big oil corporation, what are you going to do? Are you going to pay a lobbyist £100,000? And if you pay a professional lobbyist, that will go into the lobbying register, so you'll be looked up, it'll go in the paper to try and organise meetings for you. Or do you pay a think tank? You could pay a think tank like half of that. They'd write a report that will probably be very close to what you'd like them to say. That will get all over the press. It'll be in all the newspapers, the right-wing newspapers. They'll probably get invited onto the BBC, and you'll get huge amount of publicity. By its own estimates, the Institute of Economic Affairs, I think it was a couple of years ago, said when its budget was around £2 million a year to turnover, that they reckoned it had £66 million worth of advertising from being in the media, which is exactly what Donald Trump did in 2016 as well. Actually, it's owning the media space. It's very, very clever, and and you're only able to do it if you're good at what you do. If you're good at selling this, these guys have been very, very good at this, and it's been remarkable to see how they've been able to capture so much of the British political debate. And this might sound quite far-fetched, but if you think about where we are now, we are looking down the barrel of a no-deal Brexit in a very, very, very different British politics in 2020 than we were 4 or 5 years ago. So they really have shifted what you'd call the Overton Window, this idea that there's some ideas that you're trying to change the ideas that are talked about. So they've been very successful at doing that.
Yeah, there's two things there, isn't there? One is that the movement of the idea from something that was previously considered to be ridiculous, not even worthy of discussion, to actually being a viable policy option. That's very impressive. And again, it comes back to what you were saying earlier about just the value for money. If that translation between whatever, £2 million in turnover to £60 million of media space, you're getting extraordinary value for money. So we're clearly seeing some big factors of magnitude here, which leads me to my next question, which is why does this matter? What is the sort of consequence for our democracy as a result?
I think that's a huge part of it. I think it's the way what would be very niche policy positions can then become the mainstream. An interesting example of this is the idea of a free port. So free ports is this idea that you can set up these little, basically all around the country, you could have what it sounds like, a port where there's basically a different tax regime. It's kind of a very, very outdated idea. There's quite a few of them across the European Union have been trying to get rid of. It kind of harks back to the 19th and 20th century. It was an idea that really had no traction anywhere. About 2 or 3 years ago, a couple of people who were interested in this, who had a financial interest in ports, who owned ports, paid for a couple of lobbyists to write up a paper about it. Next thing you know, it's been pushed by very many of the people who are involved in these same think tanks. MPs on the right of the Conservative Party are picking it up. There's a British government that says it wants to have this new bold vision of global Britain, doesn't really know what to put in it. This looks like a new policy. Let's pick that up. And next thing you know, the day we left the European Union on the 31st of January of this year, the Department for International Trade put out one of the things it highlighted was it sent a tweet going, we can now pursue our free port policy. A lot of people think free ports are an opportunity for gangsters and fraudsters to make a fortune and don't really give anything back to the local economy. But because there's a kind of policy vacuum, there's a great opportunity for it. And it's highly unlikely to be the only thing that this is happening around. We're probably going to see this with a lot of stuff. And I think that's where there's huge opportunities. And we're seeing as well, when political parties are very dependent on funders to survive, there's a huge opportunities for conflict of interest. We're seeing that in the planning system as well, and I think we're likely to see it in a lot of other areas too. The Russia report still hasn't been published. More than 6 months after it was supposed to be published, that report into Russian interference in British politics is widely expected to talk about political donors who are often dual citizens, or at least have a lot of connections to Russia, who are donating into British politics as well. So there's huge opportunities to change, especially once we're because we're in a very febrile political moment too. There's a lot of kind of things happening very quickly. So the opportunity, if you've got access, if you're somebody that's known into government, I think there's a lot more opportunity to get your voice heard and get policies instigated that you would want.
What hope then for the humble British voter? I mean, potentially. I mean, when you phrase it like when we've been talking about the sums we've been talking about, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. The average voter could conjure up or raise enough money to buy themselves a seat at the table. Is that the best course of action? Is that for you to receive your representation in this country?
I think it's a very interesting question, and my book talks a lot about online politics as well. And if you look at, say, the 2019 general election, it seems like a long time ago. But if you cast our mind back to that too, and you think about some of the things that went on, the Conservative Party rebranding their Twitter account as a fact-checking account during a live debate, a huge amount of anonymous advertising going on, really, pushing very, very extreme lines, away from political parties. That kind of sense that you've got groups been able to who are not, and that's very much what you see in America too, these kind of outriders who then push the narrative. I think the difficulty for the ordinary decent British citizen who wants to try and change the debate is every time, I think when you try and engage with it like that and you try and go from the other side, you end up in a nuclear arms race. Everyone starts pushing further and further, and rather than helping to get a seat at the table, you almost up the ante. I think there's a huge there's a lot to be. I think there's a lot of rules that need to be changed. I'm not particularly confident. So at the moment, as we speak, there's the Parliamentary Standards Committee is looking into electoral laws in Britain and seeing how they should change. It's notable that one area that's explicitly outside of the remit of this commission is party funding. Which is a huge part of it. So there's a sense in which people are happy to tinker around the edges. So I'm sure we'll now see little at the moment now, if you put an advert on the internet for a political party, you don't have to put an imprint on it. Whereas if you put a letter through someone's door, you do, which is completely ridiculous. So I imagine that will now become a thing. So parties have to put little logos on it. But compared to the kind of stuff we're talking about, that's really small beer. And I think that's my big concern, is that we will see thinking around the edges, but we won't see an actual attempt to try and get to grips with it. And for the ordinary person who wants to try and kind of get engaged with politics, I think rather than trying to buy themselves 100,000 anonymous Facebook likes, I think it's trying to kind of bring this stuff to light and put it into the public domain, which I think we have seen in the last few weeks with this Geoghegan case in a way that we hadn't for quite a while. There's a discussion about party funding and political donations that had been lacking for a long time.
Peter Geoghegan, Democracy for Sale. When's it out? August
the 6th in all your good bookstores.
All good bookstores. Peter Geoghegan, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Speak to you soon.
Thank you very much.